Board. Alrighty. So thank you all again for attending today's session. My name is Jo Lee, and I, along with my colleagues, Jasmine Shoemaker and Lorraine Ojo Ohikware, founded the UMBC Library's AI and Privacy Symposium. On the heels of the successful AI Privacy and Symposium Ethics Symposium of April 2024, we're back with a new iteration. This fall's title is Exploring the Gadgets and Gizmos in Your AI Toolkit. This semester, our speakers will highlight various topics ranging from Google Gemini and its integration into UMBC platforms to the broader legal implications of using generative AI and much more. We were intentional with the selection of our speakers, remaining mindful to include librarians, teaching faculty, and students from diverse backgrounds. Although this platform is not an endorsement of specific AI tools, we wish to create an open forum for attendees to learn and interact with this ever-evolving and impactful topic. Our series would not be possible without the contributions from the following centers, departments, and organizations: the Hackerman Foundation, UMBC's Division of Information Technology, the Center for Social Science Scholarship, UMBC Center for Artificial Intelligence, the Department of Information Systems, and the Department of Computer Science and Electrical Engineering. Today we welcome Dr. Roberto Yus, our seventh speaker of the series. Dr. Yus was a postdoctoral researcher in the Computer Science Department at the University of California, Irvine, before joining UMBC. His research interests are in the fields of data management, knowledge representation, privacy, and the Internet of Things, otherwise known as IoT. His research focuses on the design of semantic data management solutions to empower IoT systems to understand user information requirements and user privacy preferences and adapt their operations taking those into account. He is broadly interested in IoT contexts spanning from smart buildings and spaces to smart water systems. In the past, Dr. Yus also worked in agent systems, location-dependent queries, context awareness, and multimedia, and has interest in those areas as well. Dr. Yus is also interested in the development and deployment of systems and tools based on his research in the real world. His work on IoT systems at UC Irvine has been deployed in several U.S. campuses. Dr. Yus's presentation today is titled The Privacy Paradox of GenAI: What It Knows, Why It Matters, and How We Fight Back. We welcome questions in the chat throughout the session. Feel free to send a private message to myself or one of my two colleagues, and we'll be sure to ask them at the end of the presentation. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to our speaker.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Let me just make sure that I'm setting the right thing. All right. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. As we all are aware at this moment, generative AI has become a very important part of our lives. We are using it in many different ways, and one of the ways that we are using is to boost our productivity. But at the same time, generative AI is quietly collecting information about us. This is obviously a problem for our privacy, and this is what we are going to explore today. I call this talk the privacy paradox because I will introduce the privacy challenges that generative AI is creating. And at the same time, I will introduce some of the research that we are doing in my lab, in the DAMS lab, to use generative AI to help protect our privacy. So we can use the technology for both ends. All right, so let's get started with a situation that might be familiar to some of you. Imagine a faculty member getting a question about advising and then asking, let's say, ChatGPT to polish the answer and giving, for example, information about the student as context, right? Just to adapt the question to the context of the student. Or imagine a staff member who is helping draft an IRB protocol and just needs to polish it up just to make it sound better, right? And then uploads the document to Gemini, for instance. Or imagine a student, and this could be, for example, one of our grad students who gets the notes of the meeting, research meeting that they just had, and uploads them to one of these systems, for example, ChatGPT again, just to make it sound more formal, right? So the output in all of these situations is a very well-written text. So the output is something very useful. But what happened with that data? What happened with the information about the student that was uploaded by the faculty? What happened with the information about the study that was uploaded by the staff member? Or what happened with those notes, potentially confidential notes, research note that the student uploaded to this platform? It's difficult to know. It's difficult to know because this is going through many different phases. This is starting as a prompt, but it's traversing different technologies, and it's not clear what's happening there. In that situation, what the faculty member, the staff member, or the students would do is the same that we all do. And I'm saying this sarcastically, which is looking at the privacy policy of the technology they've used, just to understand a little bit better what happened. Just to give you an example, these are the privacy policies of some of the widely used chatbots and generative AI technologies today. Just to give you an example, I'm going to scroll through the privacy policy of Anthropic, and I'm going to scroll fairly quickly. Let me just click here. So this is me scrolling fairly quickly. If I don't know if the audio is working, but if the audio is working, you will hear my mouse like going crazy, right? And look at how long is it taking me just to scroll through the privacy policy, obviously not reading it, right? So these are complex documents, but imagine that in this situation, the professor, the staff member, and the students go through this process. After that, they can compile the information and then they can say, hey, it seems that everything is okay because I use OpenAI, I use ChatGPT, I was using the enterprise edition of OpenAI, and there's no, I was also using, for example, a non-history chat or a temporary chat. So then nothing happened, right? All of this information is deleted after using it. Unfortunately, in that case, even after looking at the privacy policy and seeing that everything looks right, it might not be true. I don't know if you heard about this, but back in 2023, the New York Times sued OpenAI for copyright infringement. The idea was OpenAI used documents from the web, and in particular, the New York Times claims that they use these news articles to train their models, right? As a consequence of this, what happens is that there was a court order that forced OpenAI to preserve all ChatGPT data while this trial was happening, right? And when we talk about all ChatGPT data, what this effectively means is that OpenAI had to store all of the prompts that people send, even when you use the temporary chat that is supposed not to store that, right? As of 2 weeks ago, OpenAI is no longer having to preserve all of these, but there's some exceptions. So there's still some information that they have to preserve. So the professor, staff member, or a student went through the privacy policy. They thought that everything was okay. Turns out that it was not based on what it was happening, right? And by the way, this is a real scenario, right? Like, I think that this might sound familiar to many of us, but it's also happened in the past. This is just one of the many incidents. This is a situation where some Samsung employees in Korea, I think this was 2023, so a couple of years ago, they actually accidentally leaked sensitive data through ChatGPT. One of the situations is that one of the employees copy-pasted some code, proprietary code from Samsung into ChatGPT just to improve it, and obviously at that point they were using their personal accounts and they were potentially leaking that information. So this is something real, right? So today I want to tell you a little bit more about what this technology knows about us. I want to reinforce why is this important and why it matters, especially since we were talking about this just before starting the talk, that we are all so used to seeing our privacy being challenged that we become a little bit defeatist, right? So I want to make sure that you understand that this is a very important problem. I'm going to give you some pointers on how can we fight back, and then I'm going to talk about the work that we are doing in the group to use the technology to help protect our privacy. All right, so the first question that everybody asks me, what can we learn from my prompts, right? It's a very difficult question to answer. So what I would suggest is let's look at the recent past in order to get some idea of what can be learned, right? I'm highlighting here three very typical examples. You might have heard of those that are not related to GenAI. Okay, so some of these are from 2012, so years before, at least 10 years before ChatGPT was a thing. All right. The first one that you might have heard of is this situation where a father apparently got a bunch of baby coupons from Target that were addressed to his daughter, and then started wondering, is my daughter pregnant? The father didn't know, right? And it, the story is that even the girl apparently didn't know that she was pregnant, right? So Target knew before everybody else knew. And how did that happen? Well, we are predictable as humans, right? So Target started collecting data about what people purchase, and then they realized that people who end up purchasing, for example, diapers, first they purchase this kind of things, right? This kind of products. And therefore, if you're buying those kind of products, maybe you're also going to buy diapers later on, right? So this is something that has been going on for a while. The second scenario is social media. If you use tools like Facebook, for example, right? Your likes can say a lot about you. And I'm not just talking about explicit likes, right? If you like a post by a political party, that can explicitly tell something about your political affiliation, right? But there's studies that have been looking at just the things that you're liking in general, and just based on those, for example, the study that I have there, they were predicting with a high confidence, like something like 85 to 90%, whether you were a Republican or a Democrat, right? So this is a lot of information that can come from social media. And then another typical example is search engines. People have been using search engines for a while. We tend to, in the past, things have changed a little bit more, but in the around the 2013, we were giving, or we were searching queries that were mostly keywords, right? But even those keywords were giving away a lot of information about you. People were searching, for example, symptoms or conditions, or they were searching for the stuff like, hey, I have diabetes, like recommend me things, right? That is another place where a lot of our information that we might consider sensitive was potentially inferred by those companies, right? So these are just some examples, but what about GenAI? So we could say that GenAI is a combination of all of these, because when we use generative AI, we use it for many different things, but we use it, for example, to plan our purchases. We use it, for example, to hear about specific topics, and we use it, for example, to search for information about things that relate to our daily lives. But it's also more than that, right? And there's some scenarios which are going to some other ethical questions that I'm not going to touch on here, right? And I think some of the previous speakers have been talking about those, but that are also a very big problem in terms of privacy. So, for instance, we are seeing that an increasingly amount of young people are using ChatGPT as their therapist. I'm not going to go into the ethical aspect of it, but just think about the privacy aspect of it, right? So they will be sharing stuff that maybe they have never shared with anybody else, right? And the stuff that is potentially very sensitive. Because it's talking about their mental health and it's talking about things that are going on in their lives, right? That is already something that we didn't see as much in the past as before generative AI came around, right? Another scenario is people using generative AI as a partner, and they are developing relationships with these bots. Again, I'm not going to go into the ethical aspect of it, whether this is a good idea or not, but I'm just going to focus on the privacy side of things, right? Just imagine if you're treating the technology as your partner, the information that you might be sharing with the technology, right? Like the same that you will share with your partner. You might share the most personal things about your, for example, sexual preferences or anything that is going on in your life, right? So again, these are things that we were not necessarily sharing with other technology before, right? And then there's something else that I know that you might be already aware, but I wanted to explicitly touch upon, which is when we use generative AI technology, we use text, but we are increasingly using this in a multimedia fashion. So for example, we are uploading pictures, we are uploading documents, and those documents sometimes and those pictures sometimes might have explicit location data because maybe you click that picture with your phone and then your location is there, right? And this is something that companies have been analyzing for a very long time, right? So now generative AI can do this at a much larger scale. Just in case if you're not aware, when you upload a picture to any platform today, but specifically to generative AI, there's a lot of processing that can be done behind the curtains, right? In particular, companies might be doing facial recognition. They might detecting who is in the picture. More interestingly, they might do background recognition. And this back some years ago, this used to be, hey, is there a landscape behind you? Is there a mountain? Is there a building? But nowadays, this technology has evolved to the point that they can exactly pinpoint where this picture was taken. I teach a data privacy class, and I always use this example. There is this a person who created a tool that just based on the images that are out there in Google Street Maps is able to predict with a very high accuracy if you take a picture somewhere in some random road in the, I don't know, in Spain, it can predict where are you exactly in that moment, right? And it's very, very precise. So this is an issue with background recognition. And then obviously there's going to be object recognition too, right? They can detect what are you holding? For example, hey, I'm holding a water bottle. But the interesting thing here is that that is very accurate today, but now we are going to the next level, which is predicting what specific water bottle are you holding? And you might be wondering, what's the problem of that? Well, the problem is that if I, for example, see that you're holding a iPhone, I don't know, 16, 17, I can also infer information about your socioeconomic status, right? And this can happen very, very fast, and this can happen very effectively just based on a picture that you uploaded to generative AI. With location data is the same problem. With location data, there's a lot of information that can be inferred about you, right? For example, they can infer the school or your workplace. They can infer your house, and this is relatively easy because if you see that the location is consistently the same during the night and so on, you can infer that that's where the person lives. Based on that, they can infer your socioeconomic status, depending on where do you live. There's a lot of other stuff that can be inferred. And as I said, these location data sometimes can come directly from the pictures, or sometimes it can come from anywhere, right? Like because this is metadata that sometimes is associated with the documents that we upload to the generative AI system. By the way, I hope that you keep this in mind next time that there's one of those viral trends that is about, giblifying my face, right? So when you upload this, the technology is going to give you what you want, but at the same time, the technology could, underneath, extract a lot of information about you. Now, okay, this technology can infer a lot about you, right? Now, if you look at what has happened in history with other similar technologies and what is happening today with generative AI, the companies will tell you, yes, we collect a lot of information, we can potentially infer a lot of information, but don't worry because this information is just processed by your algorithms, right? Our algorithm is going to figure out that, I don't know, you're a professor at UMBC, and then it's going to give you a better answer based on that context. But my question is that always the case? And we can see numerous examples where that's not true. For example, and this is a bit old, but it's happening even today. When you have an Alexa device at home, yes, Alexa, the software is processing your audio, but in order to train and make that device understand you better, there's humans in the loop sometimes. There's humans that are listening to that conversation and labeling them and saying, I have an Spanish accent. Sometimes when I talk with Alexa, it doesn't understand my accent, right? So it's saying, hey, he meant this specific word. Based on that, even if you anonymize it, which is something that we will touch on later, I can still figure out things like, for example, your home address. And there's a lot of horror stories, right? Where engineers within the companies have access to the data. Obviously, they will claim that it's in a privacy-preserving manner, but as we can see, it's not always true. The next argument I will say is like, okay, yes, sure, or engineers might have access to your data, but don't worry because nobody else, apart from like the partners, and you agree to that when you use the service, but nobody else will get access to the data, right? My question is like, never, is that true? And we can see a lot of examples where this is not always the case, right? For instance, something that is worrisome is that governments and law enforcement offices are requiring these companies to give them data. For example, if you have one of those ring cameras outside of your home, just to notify you when someone drops a package, right? So the police is asking sometimes Amazon directly, sometimes the customer to get access to the recordings to investigate something, right? And the demands by the government to get access to the data is increasing like significantly. And there's scenarios that are scary. For example, imagine that there's a protest like what happened in Hong Kong in 2020, and now suddenly the government or the authorities require one company to give information about who was taking part of this demonstration, right? And obviously, there's other examples like the Cambridge Analytica that maybe you've all heard about, right? And by the way, this is happening right now with generative AI too. This is fresh out of the oven. This is October 20th, and DHS already ordered OpenAI to share some prompts and data from a user. By the way, again, I'm not going to touch on the ethical part of it because this is a case where you can say that, hey, this is justified. There was some child exploitation investigation in the process, but if DHS can order the company to give this data for this reason, they can order it for many other reasons, right? And now we have to depend on the company or we have to trust that either the government will ask for the right reasons or that the company will take care of only the right request, right? But this is challenging. Another thing that they will tell you is like, all right, yes, we share sometimes data, but don't worry because this data is anonymized before we share it. First of all, I want to say that we have to be careful with data breaches, right? And because data breaches are true, like are real, right? And I'm going to show you another very recent example where there was a data breach and then Grok chats, the chats that you have with the XAI technology, were exposed in Google results. So people could Google and then they will get, as a result, chats that people were having with the technologies. This is a breach. This is something that was not intended, so therefore it's a breach. But let's assume for a second that there's no breaches, and then they anonymize the data, right? Is anonymization enough? And by the way, anonymization typically is something like removing the personally identifiable information. For instance, the typical anonymization is if I have information about the conditions of people, I just remove their names, and then I release an anonymized version of the dataset. Well, this is very old and you might have heard of it, but it's a perfect example on why anonymization doesn't work. Back in 2006, AOL, which for those of you who are young, it was a search engine and it's not there anymore, but it was very popular at the moment. So they released anonymized data sets of searches that people were doing. And the idea was releasing this so that then the community could develop better algorithms and whatnot, right? The New York Times went into that anonymized data set, which was something like user 123 asked this query, and then they were able to expose one of the users 44177749. who was that nice lady on the picture on the right. And what they did was something very trivial. What they did is they looked for queries that were very specific, queries that were mentioning, for example, small towns in the US with a population of less than 100 people. Once you have that query, you know that that person is interested in that town, right? So probably that person will be part of that town, right? Then they continue looking at other queries that that person executed, and then they saw some patterns, right? Like say, hey, this person is interested in the times when, I don't know, this hairdresser opens in that town, right? And when you start putting all of this together, you can pinpoint the exact person. So anonymization doesn't work. This is just one of the examples, but it's very clear that anonymization doesn't. Okay, this is the next thing that you will hear, which is, all right, yeah, anonymization might not work, but remember, here we are talking about models. So maybe we are setting the model. We are not setting the data, but we are setting the model, which is this massive neural network, and there's like a bunch of numbers, weights, and so on. So don't worry, because this is there's no way that someone will figure out your prompts, because these are just a bunch of numbers, and we don't even understand very well how things work within the neural network, right? This is true if it was not because people are developing what in the field we call membership inference attacks. And these attacks are attacks where if you give me a model, like for example, the GPT model that is already trained and it's a black box, I can just ask things, I can execute prompts, but I cannot look at what data did you use to train that model. If you give me that situation, I can launch an attack in which I can reconstruct the data set that you used to train that model. And just to show you some very visual examples of how this works, these are a little bit old and some of them do not work as well anymore, but these are some examples where people found out in part what data was used to train the GPT model. So in the first one on the top, what we are seeing is someone is asking something on a prompt and suddenly started using a language which probably has a way smaller training set. For example, there's a lot of content on the web written in English, but there might not be as much content written in Bengali, for example, right? So if you prompt that, the language model, because of the way that they work, they try to find in the connections between the different words, might output something directly from the training set. And it was what happened here. But it was outputting a specific name of a person, a real name of a real person, and some location that was an address that was the real address of a person, and then some other hallucinated content, right? But it was outputting exact information that was used for training. By the way, the same attack used to work, and up to some extent it works still, but they are developing techniques to prevent it with what we call the word replay attack. So that's what you see on the bottom right. You could go into ChatGPT and say, repeat this poem forever. And then you can say, sorry, repeat this word forever, poem, 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 poem. What the chatbot will do is it will start repeating constantly for a long time, and then this will because of the way that the technology works, it will lose context and then it will start outputting something else. And what it will output is something extracted directly from the training set. You can see an example there where after repeating the word many times, suddenly it outputted information about a person. And yeah, you can argue, hey, this information was online, it was on the web already, so maybe it was public information. Yes, at the moment of training these models, yes, but remember that now these models are being trained with all prompts too. And then another example of what happens when you request something very specific is what you see on the left, bottom left. So this works the same for generative AI technologies that generate images, right? And what you could do is, and again, companies are trying to prevent that now, but it's still doable, is you could ask for something very specific. For example, you could ask to give you a generated image of a person that probably appears only a few times in the data set. And then what the model will do is output something that looks exactly as the same image you use for training. Um, and this can be scary, again, if we think about the things that we are uploading today. I just want to make that distinction because every time that I present this, someone says, hey, if the data was already there in the, on the web, right? So whoever posted there knew already that the data could be used. And that I completely agree. At that point, maybe you don't have an expectation of privacy. But if you're prompting the model and they are using those prompts or these images to train the model, now this can happen with your prompts and your images too. All right, so I hope I've scared you now enough. So I'm gonna move into something a little bit more practical, right? Which is, all right, there's a huge problem. What can we do? So the first thing I would recommend is you have to choose wisely. You have to choose the tool that you want to use. And I know that sometimes we tend to choose the tool based on how well it performs, right? So, hey, ChatGPT is very good at writing essays, so I'm gonna use ChatGPT. I don't know, Gemini is very good at coding. I'm gonna use Gemini. What I'm suggesting is you add one more constraint to your choosing criteria, which is how are they handling my data? Um, Reading the privacy policies is not fun, as you can imagine, so you don't have to necessarily do it yourself. I'm showing you here a very recent paper where they analyze the privacy policies of different companies that have generative AI technologies out there. And then they extracted the most interesting information. So on the table at the top, you can see information about their data practices. And then on the bottom, you can see what are the sources of data that they use to train their models. Okay. The first thing I just want to highlight, I'm not going to go through the table. Of course, you can take a look at it yourselves. But the first thing I want to highlight is, unfortunately, yes, we live in a world today where a company can put a privacy policy out there that doesn't specify something as important as whether the chat input is used for training by default, right? That's very scary, and that's something that in some situations shouldn't even be legal, right? There's different legal privacy protection regulations out there, and these are things that can conflict with those, right? But this is something that is already scary. If you see that, my recommendation is think the worst, right? So probably in this case, it means that yes, they are using it by default. Um, then with respect to the data that we input and when we, for example, send prompts or documents and so on, different companies have different policies with respect to whether they use that for training or not. What you can see is that unfortunately, if you look at the table below, is that most of them are yes or not specified, which in my opinion is also a yes, right? So this is something that is you have to be careful with. I want to just clarify one thing, which is take into account that some of these companies have both personal accounts and enterprise accounts. And the privacy policy might not be the same for a personal and an enterprise account. In particular, this study was mostly focusing on information about personal accounts, but there's companies like, for example, OpenAI, where if you have an enterprise account, they promise that they won't use the input of your chats for training. That's the only way that they can sell this to corporations, right? Imagine you're a big corporation, you have important sensitive information, and I'm not necessarily talking about private information about your customers. I'm talking about confidential data from your processes, right? And you don't want the system to train on that. So be careful with this. Choose wisely, which means choose looking at what are the pros and the cons of the technology, and please add privacy as one of these things that you look into. And by the way, remember that policies change, and policies change very frequently. One of the things that I can show you is Anthropic, which is a company that started by saying, hey, we want ethical generative AI. It was a company that was pushing for privacy in the beginning. And then very recently, they inadvertently changed their privacy policy. And then they said that Claude, which is their GenAI system, is going to use your chats for training. Um, Fortunately, there's a way to opt out, but by default, your chats are being used. And this is something that changed from one day to the other. So unfortunately, you have to keep up with these changes. Some of these companies, if you have an account, they email you an email that sometimes has a lot of information, but it says, these are the changes that we have effectuated, right? And that can give you more information. But even in that situation, I again suggest that you read the privacy policy. Or you ask someone else to read the privacy policy, which is a topic I'm going to touch on later. All right. What else can you do? And I'm going to show you some things that are maybe you're already doing. I just wanted to have like 5 practical habits that you can do, that you can follow if you care about your privacy when using generative AI. So the first one, remember, some of these models or some of these chatbots, they have what in browsers would be called incognito modes, right? So modes where they tell you and they guarantee that these are temporary and the data won't be stored. Okay. Sometimes this is called temporary chats. Sometimes this is called non-history chats. So if this is something sensitive, my recommendation would be to use it. Of course, with privacy, there's no free lunch. If you use this, once you're done with that specific chat, you won't be able to access that data again. So I'm telling you because, for example, if I recall correctly, with ChatGPT, if you use a temporary chat, even if you keep the chat open, if you come back to it, I think it's 24 hours later, you cannot use that chat anymore. So there's a pro and a con. Another thing that I want to make sure that you understand is that, like incognito modes, these are better than nothing, but it doesn't mean that they are 100% privacy protecting. In particular, if you look at the privacy policies of these companies, they all mention that the input that you put into one of these temporary modes is going to be analyzed to see if there's something that has to be reported to the authorities. This is something, what is not clear is whether this is done manually or automatically. But remember, in both cases, but especially if it's done automatically, things might be triggered as potentially reportable that might not be reported, right? So keep in mind that even temporary modes are not 100% privacy preserving. Another very important advice that I have for you is to redact information that might be sensitive. And this means, please, if you're using, for example, if you're using ChatGPT to help you polish an email, right? Don't add information like in the case that I was describing before, right? Like the full name of the student, or don't add information about phone numbers or stuff that might be sensitive. And by the way, not to get too paranoid, but my suggestion is you redact this stuff before you even put the prompt into the system. I think that people are not aware that when you're typing something on a chatbot, on a website, on an app, right? Your keystrokes can be recorded, right? So it doesn't mean that you have to wait until you press enter or press submit, right? So the moment that you're typing something, the application, the system, they could potentially store that information too, right? So if you want to be safe, my recommendation is write it somewhere in a notepad or something and redact the information and then put it back. By the way, take into account that redacting might mean redacting documents that you put into it. And keep in mind that documents have metadata associated. And that metadata might be something as simple as the name of the document. If the document says, I don't know, like a social security number, Roberto you, something, that might give information already, right? So redacting is also redacting the names of the documents and potentially removing metadata. If you're uploading a picture, maybe you want to remove metadata about the location. Another advice, and this is a general advice for anything related to technology. If there's something related to work and something related to your personal life, try to separate those, right? Some corporations and organizations, for example, at UNBC, we have access to some of this technology, right? If this is something related to work, that is the entry point you should use. If this is something personal, my recommendation is you use your personal account. One of the reasons is that people are, not everybody's aware, but depending on the specific setup, these enterprise chatbots, they don't learn from the data, they don't use that for training, but whoever is in charge of the organization can look at that. I'm not saying that UNBC is spying on your prompts, but what I'm saying is that potentially someone, depending on the specific organization plan, someone could look into that information. So keep that in mind and then keep things that are personal, your personal account, things that are work related in your enterprise accounts. By the way, as I said, enterprise accounts tend to, by default, opt you out from using your prompts or your documents for training. You might want to check in your personal account whether that option is enabled. And my recommendation is assume always that by default you're opt-in, so go find the privacy options and change that. Um, as I said, another important aspect of enterprise is that sometimes there might be confidential tasks, even if it's something that you're not sure if this is more work or personal, but this is something that might contain confidential information about your organization, you might want to use an enterprise account. Um, People are exploring now what is called on-device systems. These are generative AI technologies that you can install on your laptop, even on your phone, and then you can use locally. This is even more privacy preserving because the data is going to most likely reside locally. I cannot guarantee it 100% because without looking at the code, you'd never know if the data is transferred, right? But the data is going to remain in your device. This is a very good option. Obviously, again, this is a situation where there's no freelance, right? The kind of generative AI model you can put on your laptop is not going to be as powerful as the model that you can execute on the cloud. And finally, keep in mind that some of these systems are keeping your chats alive. If you don't delete them by default, they are going to be there. My recommendation is if this is something you want to preserve, export it. There's always options to export the chats, keep it in your local machine, for example, keep it encrypted somewhere, keep it somewhere safe. And if you want to use it in the future, you can access it there, right? But my recommendation is if you're not using all chats, delete them because you don't want the data to be there and then suddenly the privacy policy changes and now they start using the data, or now there's a data breach and they get access to your data. And in general, my recommendation is the New York Times rule that you might have heard, which is don't put anything in writing that you wouldn't want to see published on the front page of the New York Times. This applies completely to generative AI. Don't put something there that you would be too embarrassed to see published in a news article. All right, so now just to conclude, I'm going to go a little bit quickly through things that we are doing in my lab to use the technology. This is collaborative work with Portland State University, and this was work led by my PhD student, Namir. What we are trying to do is we are trying to use generative AI to build generative AI privacy assistants. So imagine these as specialized chatbots that will be able to assist you with your privacy questions or potentially even cybersecurity questions. By the way, we are calling those GenAIPAs. As I showed you before, reading privacy policies is very difficult. And since they change, you have to keep on reading. Back in 2008, a while ago, they estimated that it will take a person 201 hours a year to read the privacy policies of all the services you interact with, right? Obviously, this is too much. So can we get agents that read these privacy policies for us and then maybe do it in seconds? The problem is you don't want to be in a situation where you ask, if you're the professor in the first slide, you ask the agent, did I mess up? And they tell you you're fine. Then you ask again and they tell you, oh, you actually messed up, right? So this is the problem of hallucinations. What we are doing in my group is first, we are developing what we call privacy exams. These people have created a lot of different benchmarks and exams for the technology. So we are creating one more that evaluates how good is the technology at answering questions about privacy. We presented this work where we have a set of questions that is coming from real users. We are including even paraphrasing, which means that we are changing the wording of the questions just to reflect a diverse population. And then we are presenting a set of metrics to evaluate how good the answer was. We have annotated answers, and then we can compare the performance. This is a busy slide, but what I want you to pay attention is if you look at the left is showing you how good different chatbots were answering questions based on the privacy policy of Spotify, Uber, and so on. And what we see is that on average, they work well. So if you see on the top, the first column, it shows you that on average, it was obtaining maybe an 80 out of 100 in our privacy exam. The problem is that that's the average. Some of the answers were very bad. And this is what I'm highlighting with those red boxes, right? So sometimes it was even a 0 out of 100. So that's a problem. And then when they fail very badly, right? And when we look more deeply at what is the main issue, what we see is that even though things are evolving and improving, accuracy It's one of the main issues. So the text is relevant. It sounds relevant to the question that you ask. The text is clear. You can understand it much more than when you read the privacy policy, but the text is not accurate. There's hallucinations. And more importantly, they tend to mess up referencing things. If you ask, where did you read that? They tend to mess up. So what are we doing to help with these issues? We are exploring the combination of the strengths of multiple LLMs. This is based on what we do in real life, which is sometimes people give you bad advice, right? So how do you get the best advice? You ask multiple people and then you combine the answers, right? So this is something that we are exploring. So can we ask multiple models or questions about privacy, combine the answers, and then figure out what the solution is? There's a lot of challenges we are solving there, but this is the general idea of what we are doing. And the goal then will be that you will have an interface where you can ask your questions, and you will get an accurate answer about your privacy or cybersecurity questions. Now, before I conclude, I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about beyond GenAI, because there's some stuff that is very, very troubling. So the first one is I was focusing mostly on GenAI chatbots because this is the purpose of this series, but it's not just about chatbots. First of all, we are entering the age of AI browsers. And this is something that scares me a lot, not only from the point of view of privacy, but from the point of view of now there's something that is going to impersonate you and it's going to be doing things on your behalf, right? Those are agents in general, but these are agents that will be using your browser. We have seen that even the browsers that they have released already are already being hacked. And these hacks are not like sophisticated hacks. These are hacks similar to the ones that I showed you when we were talking about membership inference attacks. So prompting strategies like changing things in the website, adding instructions to the website that will make the AI browser do something or give away information about you. For example, what are the previous pages that you have visited, right? Keep in mind that these AI browsers are going to keep a history not only of the pages they visited themselves, but of the pages that you visited yourself, right? And this is a huge privacy issue. One that is even more concerning, in my opinion, is AI operating systems, if you want to call it that way. I don't know if you saw this, but a year ago, Microsoft announced that Windows was going to include a new functionality called Recall that was going to take screenshots of everything that is on your screen every few seconds. And the idea was, hey, maybe yesterday you were looking at some pictures that someone showed you, and then now you're like, hey, who sent me that picture? Or tell me more about the picture. So then the operating system could go back and figure that out. Or maybe you open a document and then you delete it, and then you want the operating system to go back and tell you this was what the document was saying. Again, is that useful? Yes, it is. But think for a second. There's something on your computer that is taking a screenshot of what is going on your computer every few seconds, right? Imagine the implications to your privacy from your filling out your taxes and you're putting your personal information there to your visiting websites to your doing anything with pictures from your family, right? So this is a huge issue. Fortunately for us, people started complaining, and it's not clear what is going to happen with this technology, but at least this is not going to be an opt-in by default. People will have to opt in. Another one that I'm very concerned about is the rise of AI meeting transcription bots. You might have seen those. For example, Otter AI is one of those. They join your calls and then they impersonate a person, record everything, and then give a transcript to the person. Is that useful? Yes, it is. But then there's a lot of privacy implications. For example, if you see here in this specific Otter AI tool, I went into the privacy policy yesterday, so this is as of yesterday, and they explicitly say, we train our proprietary artificial intelligence on de-identify audio recordings. We also train our technology on transcriptions. Red flag. It says de-identified, which is the same that anonymize, right? So do you want to see what anonymization means? Anonymization means this. I sent this prompt where I said, as an assistant professor at UMBC who studied at the University of Zaragoza and does research on IoT, privacy, and AI, I don't like that. Anonymizing is removing that this came from me. But if you had to guess who posed this question, most likely you're going to guess that it was me, right? Scary stuff. By the way, there's people who are already challenging this in court at the moment. And finally, and I will end with this, this impacts you even if you don't use AI directly. Please be careful, because now all corporations are trying to train their systems. So more and more applications are starting to collect your information and train AI with it. Facebook recently had this tool where they are going to go through your pictures and then they are going to train their algorithms. LinkedIn, and this was something I want to thank Rick Forno, who is in the audience, who noticed this and informed all of us. LinkedIn is looking at your data and is training their models too. And then there's other stuff, like for example, Amazon now just unveiled these AI smart glasses that their delivery people are gonna wear, so they are gonna be taking pictures around you. So please be aware of these things. And yeah, I want to conclude here. I'm sorry for being the privacy party boomer, but I think I have to highlight this. I want to highlight it not with a pessimistic point of view of like, hey, you're doomed, but I want to highlight it just so that you're aware. When we are aware of these things and we take action, things change. When people complain about that feature from Windows, they change. When people complain about some of this opt-in by default, the companies change. More importantly, when people complain about this stuff, legislation comes, and legislation pushes the companies to have to take your privacy into account. So don't despair, be optimistic, but keeping this in mind when you use the technology. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roberto. And I think I speak for a lot of us when I say you are not a party bummer. This is very much needed, necessary information that we needed to hear, and for some of us needed to be reminded of that it is worth speaking up about so that policies can change. Um, we're going to go ahead and pivot to questions now from our participants in chat. I believe we had someone asking, is deleting data really deleting it? So like, even if you try to do your best to cover your trail, to kind of delete the data that you have, unwillingly or unknowingly put out, is that possible?
That's a fantastic question. So first of all, most of this software is proprietary software, right? So we don't know what is happening. The best that we can do is we can trust what they say that they are doing. If they say that when you delete your data, the data is deleted, you have to trust that. I don't want to be also Jack nihilist or something and say like, hey, we have to distrust everything. One assumes that there's organizations like FDC or others that will take care of checking this, right? But yeah, we don't know. The answer is we don't know. But my suggestion is assume that if they say that they delete it, they delete it. And if you want to delete something, request to delete. By the way, there's privacy regulations now that force companies to delete your data if you request that to be deleted, right? In Maryland, we just passed a very comprehensive privacy law. If you're a European and you're in Europe, there's even more comprehensive regulations there, and they have to give you an option to delete the data.
Thank you for answering that question. There was another question I had. I believe that was one of your recommendations for how to safeguard your data better. And I think one of the recommendations was not to share your university ID or UID, depending on where your affiliation is. I do, however, have a question because I think a lot of campuses are trying to integrate the AI tools more, and some of them
Right,
require you to use or sign on using your UID. I think
right.
I'm not sure about the AI tools that is on the Do It's page for our campus, but I know University of Maryland just released TERP AI, and TERP AI is very much integrated with the UID system. And so I'm wondering, is there any kind of workaround around that? Like, is the answer just don't use it at all, period?
No, of course, the answer is don't use it at all, because these are useful technology, right? That would be the same that if I tell you, hey, don't, your smartphone is tracking your location, right? And so don't use your smartphone at all, right? So that's not my advice, but it's true. One thing that you have to check, and again, the best that we can do is to look at the privacy policy, right? Is that logging something that the university has created outside of the technology, right? Like, so is that a door into getting into the technology, right? If that is the case, then once you're in the technology, maybe you can change your username there if your username defaults to your email, right? But this is true, and this is something that unfortunately is very difficult to change, right? Because organizations have to pay for the amount for the people who use their enterprise services, so they have to make sure that you're part of the organization. So my suggestion is, like, the same that I was saying before: keep personal things personal, keep business things business, right? So if you're using your business account, don't use it for personal matters, right? That's the best advice I can give.
Thank you very much. There's another question, I believe, regarding what you had mentioned earlier about using testing these Gen AI tools to be able to read and comprehend privacy policies, which I thought was really fascinating to learn about, to read about, especially with your work and your research on that. I guess my question is, like, once you believe these tools have reached an optimal level of being able to read and interpret privacy policies and correctly attribute the references that are in the privacy policies, I guess what is your ultimate goal or hope that these tools will be able to do once they've been optimized to correctly and accurately reiterate the privacy policies of these companies?
Very good question. So first, getting there is going to be a challenge by itself, right? Like, so my PhD student is developing just a full thesis, and there's potentially more work for more theses just to get to that point, right? But once we get to that point, now you have a technology that will enable you to ask questions about how to protect yourself, right? Like, this is something that I think that it's very challenging right now, right? For example, you're asking me, how can I avoid this problem with the business account being related to my email? These are the kind of questions that you will be able to ask this system, right? And then you will get an answer. That's the final goal that we have in mind. But getting there is going to be very difficult. Just to give you some pointers of things that we are looking at, first of all, hallucinations are there to stay. Hallucinations are part of the technology. The technology, in my opinion, the technology as it is right now cannot exist without hallucinations, because you don't want something that it always answers the same. You want something that sometimes outputs something else, right? So we have to deal with that problem. We have to minimize those, right? How do we do that? Then another very interesting challenge that we are dealing with right now is how can we prevent this technology that is trying to help you in preserving your privacy from learning more about you, right? So if you ask a question about, is my smartwatch collecting my data, right? Now the technology knows that you have a smartwatch, right? Can we do something smart to prevent the technology from knowing that? So those are some of the challenges we are trying to tackle in order to develop this technology.
Thank you very much. We have two additional questions in the chat. One of them is asking, online scammers seem to be using more personal information about individuals, probably available to anyone online to target them. Is this related?
Yes, definitely. I think one of the challenges, when I was talking about comparing with the past, with, for example, your Google searches, right? One of the things is that the way that you interact with Google, right, is different than the way that you interact in real life, right? Like, so you don't ask Google the same way that you ask your friend. The way that you ask this technology is more natural, right? And this technology is learning from a lot of different sources. So then in the end, what this technology can enable people is to create a very good impersonator of yourself, right? Someone who talks like you. And we are seeing this. I'm originally from Spain. In Spain, I don't think we've faced that in the US yet, but in Spain, there was this scam going on where they will train a model based on information about you. Part of it will be your WhatsApp messages. They will hack into your account with different ways, right? They will send you a link or a file or something. Then they will learn about you, and now they will have a chatbot that talks like you. What they will do then is this chatbot will start messaging your family members. It will message, for example, your parents, and it would use the way that you call your parents, right? Like, you don't say, like, maybe you have a special word for them, right? So they will use that, and then they will get money out of them. So this is definitely a problem. So they are able to replicate us. So that's kind of it's the main privacy challenge, if you wish, right? Because it's not only learning some stuff about you, but it's learning everything about you and being able to replicate you.
Thank you so much for answering that question. We have time, I think, for one more. Um, how can we balance visibility and privacy on LinkedIn, especially when sharing information for job opportunities? Since our resumes and profiles are shared across many job portals, what are the best ways to safeguard our personal information while still being discoverable to employers?
Great question. And this is yet another question that highlights this dichotomy of what we call privacy versus utility, right? Which is if you want to get something out of it, sometimes you have to give away some information. Unfortunately, we have to play by the rules of the organization, right? Or the company. In this case, if you're using LinkedIn, and your goal, primary goal, and especially given how tough the market is right now, is to find jobs, the best that you can do is please check the options, the privacy options of the website, right? In this case, LinkedIn has a way to opt out from your data being used for training AI models. My suggestion is use that, right? Unfortunately, in other situations, there's no opt-out option, right? You either use the technology or not. And that's the point where you have to balance things out, right? And then you have to figure out whether what you want to get is compensates the fact that you're going to give some information about you. In that situation, my recommendation is be careful with what you put out there, right? For example, if you're putting a resume and then you're using your cell phone number, right? This is, keep in mind that someone in the future could ask, one of these generative AI systems could ask, hey, give me an example of a good phone number. And it might output mine, right? So you might start getting calls. So there's always things that you can do, right? For example, you can use a virtual phone number if you don't want to use your cell phone number, right? So be careful with the information that you put there. More importantly, be aware that this information is going to be there and is going to be used. And if there's no other way, there's not much you can do. But if there's ways in which you can maybe redact part of it, or you can do something like that, that is always helpful. One very quick small advice that I have for people is be careful when you put your email out there, right? If you put your email as a real email with just text, rys@umbc.edu, that's so easy for a bot to just parse and then start sending you a random email. On the other hand, if you put it as, for example, your username and then in another line at UMBC, or if you do some other trick, sometimes people put an image or something. Yeah, you're making it harder for people to send you an email, but you're also making it harder for the technology to enable spammers to send you stuff.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again for taking the time to answer the questions. And let's wrap it up here. Thank you all so much for attending. And a huge, huge thank you again to Dr. Yus for his presentation. To continue supporting future symposia, please reach out to the members of this group to offer support, monetary support, and/or recommendations for future speakers and topics. We also greatly value your feedback, so please be sure to fill out our feedback form, which will be linked in the chat. There it is. Okay. Um, we hope to see you back here next Wednesday, November 12th, for our final speaker event in this series. Dr. Eric Stoken will be presenting on advanced opportunities with AI and large language models, examples from the social sciences. And we'll go ahead and put the information in the chat. There it is. Alrighty. I'll go ahead and stop the recording now.